Good evening. My name is Uta Peugen. I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern. And it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to our 24th Solomon Morton Memorial Lecture. I should really know all of those names at this point. And as you, I think many of you probably know, this lecture is always a key part and really the keynote part of a week of reflection that we have at Northeastern, a week of reflection that started in 1977 and has carried on until this year and will continue, that has focused in particular on the Holocaust. It has this year really, with the support from the organizing committee, taken on a somewhat different dimension in the sense that this year's organizing committee has made the question of comparative genocide an explicit part of our week-long events. And so I hope very much that you have the opportunity to see more of the events in this series. Let me then talk to you. Oh, and I also want to alert you that, of course, some of you witnessed earlier, others may have missed, that we, in fact, at this point now have a digital collection in our library that you can access that, in fact, details the long history of Holocaust commemoration here at Northeastern. Let me start out, first of all, by thanking the committee that I already mentioned that is organizing this event, this series of events. It's really always a cross-university committee, and I want to thank them and the chair of the committee, Stotsky Professor Dov Waxman, from whom you will hear in a minute as well, for their important work for all of us here, for Northeastern and for Boston communities as well. I also hope that you will join me in thanking the Morton and Geeson families for generously supporting our efforts of bringing leading intellectuals to Boston and to Northeastern to reflect on the legacies of the Holocaust with the Robert Solomon Memorial Lecture. Let me, before we give them a round of applause, let me give you a bit of the background of this lectureship. We have to thank a chance encounter in a barbershop in Cambridge for it. Robert Solomon Morton was born in Frankfurt in Germany in 1906, in Frankfurt am Main. He was educated in the school of the Orthodox synagogue there, and a particularly harrowing experience in 1934, after the Nazis had come to power, convinced him that he had no choice but to apply for immigration to the United States. The process took 3 years and resulted in his coming to Boston. For many years, he and his wife, Sophie, were caretakers of the Hillel Foundation at Harvard University. It was during this time at Hillel that a chance meeting at a barbershop brought Robert Solomon Morton together with Bill Geeson, who was then a postdoctoral fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Geeson was quite a bit younger than Morton. He was born in 1932, also in Germany, and he went on to teach chemistry and mechanical engineering at Northeastern for over 40 years. Geeson grew up in the city that Robert Solomon Morton was forced to leave, Frankfurt am Main, and he was educated there during the Nazi years and their immediate aftermath. The encounter in Cambridge resulted in a long-time friendship and ongoing conversations between Bill Geeson and Robert Solomon Morton. Bill eventually created the Robert Solomon Memorial Lecture as a way, Morton Memorial Lecture, as a way to memorialize a person who embodied the spirit of understanding and reconciliation. And at this point, the lectureship is supported by both the Geeson family and the family of Robert Solomon Morton. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome two of Robert's grandsons as well as a great-grandson to the lecture here this evening. Again, thank you so much for supporting this ongoing conversation, for allowing us to have these important encounters here at Northeastern to this day and into the future. Let me just say then very briefly that it's a special pleasure for me as well to welcome Omar Bartov, who will really be introduced in much more detail by my colleague Dav Waxman, but to welcome Omar Bartov as this year's Morton Lecturer to Northeastern. Omar is one of the world's leading German and Holocaust historians, and I have read his work since my days in graduate school when he published Hitler's Army, Soldiers, Nazis, and the War in the Third Reich, which really reshaped our thinking on the culpability of German soldiers in World War II. I have regularly taught his wide-ranging work in courses on German history and in courses on the Holocaust and comparative genocide. And Omar was someone who I think has said that coming actually from Israel via the UK to the United States, ultimately, I think, is what allowed you to focus more on the Holocaust. One of the things that you have always insisted on is that we need to pay attention to the stories of perpetrators, of victims, and of survivors, and that we indeed have to look at those stories in dialogue. That is, of course, something that is very, very difficult. But all too often, those kinds of stories had, in fact, been told by different historians who were not necessarily in touch with one another and who were telling those stories also to different communities. So Omar has really been a very important pioneer there. He also has consistently insisted on the very intimate nature that violence, including violence during genocide and the Holocaust, has so often taken. And I think these are very important themes that he has then brought also with the long history of Bukac that came out this past year. As it happens, Omar Bartov also holds the Birkeland Distinguished Professorship in the very department at Brown University that awarded my own PhD. Omar, you actually have a director of Jewish studies as well as a dean here hailing from Brown University. And so I received my PhD in your department 24 years ago, studying under your predecessor. So again, thank you so much, Omar, for joining us today. And then let me invite Dav for giving a much more detailed and formal introduction. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Uta. I'm Dav Waxman. I'm the chair of the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee at Northeastern. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, I want to first of all thank all the members of the Holocaust Awareness Committee who are here, both past and present. If they could just stand up for a minute, and I'd just like to thank them on behalf of the university and the community for all of their work. I'd also like to thank Deborah Levinson, whose tireless efforts in putting this together and making this go seamlessly, we're all really indebted for. So thank you, Deborah. And finally, of course, I want to reiterate thanks to the Morton family who are here this evening and the Geeson family, whose commitment to Holocaust Awareness Week really has made this event possible, and we're really very, very grateful for your support. And to see two generations here this evening is really great. So thank you again. Now let me briefly introduce our speaker. You've already heard a little bit about his very distinguished biography. Omar Bartov is the John Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University. And as Dean Poiger already mentioned, he is regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on the subject of genocide and the Holocaust. And so when we were thinking about who to bring for this year's Morton Lecture, Omar Bartov's name immediately came to mind, particularly because of his long career writing about this and really bringing new insights into the study of the Holocaust and genocide in general. Omar Bartov was born in Israel and educated at Tel Aviv University and at St. Antony's College, Oxford. As Dean Poiger mentioned, his early books, and he's written many books and edited many books. His first books, The Eastern Front and Hitler's Army, challenged what was then a popular view at the time, that the Wehrmacht, that the German army was essentially apolitical and was not really an instrument of Nazism. And in fact, Professor Bartov demonstrated that they had really participated and been indoctrinated into Nazi ideology and then were deeply involved and complicit in war crimes during the course of World War II. He then turned his attention to the links between total war and genocide in his books Murder in Our Midst, Mirrors of Destruction, War, Genocide, and Modern Identity, and Germany's War and the Holocaust. From there, he had a foray into cinema, writing a book called The Jew in Cinema, which examined the recycling of anti-Semitic stereotypes in film, which is a very important subject. And from that, he moved with this interest in issues of representation and memory to examine the politics of memory in Western Ukraine and the erasure of both the memory of the Jewish presence there and the few material remnants of Jewish culture in his book, Erased Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine. Building upon that interest, particularly in Eastern Europe, in that area, in present-day Ukraine, his latest book, Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Bukach, I hope I pronounced that more or less correctly, I'm sure Professor Bartov will correct, he was published last year by Simon & Schuster. And I think this is a really seminal contribution, not only to our understanding of the Holocaust, but to our understanding of how and why genocide takes place. And we tend to focus on genocide as something that comes from the top down, as something that comes from ideologies propagated by authoritarians, dictators, and the like. And we tend to have very little understanding of how genocide occurs on the ground in a very local level, how neighbors are able to turn against neighbors, friends against friends, and communities tear themselves apart, how it occurs on that very local, kind of granular level. In this book, Professor Bartov really fills that gap in our understanding of how genocide takes place. He draws upon extensive archive sources in multiple languages, as well as his own interviews with survivors and witnesses, and traces the 400-year history of one specific Eastern European border town, a town that had a multi-ethnic population for many, many years, and that town is now part of Ukraine. And he does this to draw out this history to show how this long history of complex and intimate relationships between the different ethnic and religious groups who lived in this one town, how that prepares the way, if you like, for genocide, how genocide can occur in one particular place. It's not just the story, however, of genocide in one particular town in Eastern Europe. There's also a larger story about how mass atrocities can take place in communities around the world, whether it be in Eastern Europe during World War II, whether it be in the Balkans in the 1990s, whether it be in Rwanda, and up to, sadly, the present day. It's not just, however, a story about this larger issue. It is also, as I'm sure we will hear this evening, also a very personal story for Professor Bartov, because his own mother grew up and spent her childhood in this town, and many members of Professor Bartov's family perished there. So it is both a very personal story as well as a global story in many ways. 2 years ago, we had the honor of hosting Philip Sands as our Morton lecturer. Many of you may recall he gave an outstanding talk about his book, East-West Street, on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. Philip Sands has written about this book, and I quote, "If you imagine there might be no more to learn about the Holocaust, along comes this work of forensic, gripping, original, appalling brilliance." I think that speaks for itself. The book has been awarded many prizes, just most recently awarded a prize just today, Professor Bartov's learned. It was awarded the 2018 National Jewish Book Award in Holocaust Studies, and sure it will go on to receive many, many more awards, and we are really very honored to have Professor Bartov with us this evening. So thank you.
Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you very much for these introductions. I may make my talk shorter now because you summarized the book so well. But I'll try to still have some original thoughts on this book. What I will try to do today, and I'll try not to go over time, is to give you an idea of what the main questions were that undergirded this study, how I went about doing it, what I found out while undertaking this work, and some conclusions that I think are of larger general meaning, and that in some ways that I had not anticipated when I started this work have changed my understanding both of the Holocaust and of, in several ways, how genocide occurs and how do we understand this phenomenon. So I started this book a long time ago. I've been working on it for about 20 years and dedicated the last 10 years specifically only to this book. When I started this project, it was the 1990s. And in the early 1990s, as you may recall, several important things happened. One was the end of the communist system. The Soviet Union collapsed. Communist regimes in Eastern Europe went away. And there were those who predicted, as some of you recall, and some of you have read about it, there were those who predicted that this was the end of history, that now we had come to an historical nirvana and capitalism had won, and things would be much better than they were before. And just as these predictions were being made, two events happened. One happened in Bosnia in 1992, a genocide, an ethnic cleansing, which cost the lives of approximately 250,000 people, many of whom were killed by their own neighbors. And then 2 years later, while this was happening in Bosnia in 1994, another genocide occurred in Rwanda, which has the distinction of being the fastest genocide in history, in which about 800,000 people were killed in 10 weeks, mostly by machete and fire, actual fire, burnt in their own churches. And again, this was a genocide in which many people were killed by their own neighbors, by people they knew very well. Another aspect of the 1990s that was relevant to my thinking was that it was only at that time that the Holocaust, although everybody knew that the Holocaust had occurred and people had been studying it to some extent, that the Holocaust actually came to be recognized as a major event in the 20th century. We tend to think that this was always the case, but that is false. Until the 1980s, the Holocaust was actually not considered to be an important event apart from within Jewish communities, to some extent in Germany. But by and large, if you were to read books on World War II, written in the 1950s, 60s, even 70s, you'd be hard put to find even a reference to Auschwitz or to the extermination of the Jews. And so this was a very long process. And it was only in the 1980s that the Holocaust started coming into public recognition, and only in the 1990s that it came into international recognition. But in the 1990s, that happened. And And it was an important moment. It had to do also with the fall of communism and the fact that East European countries that wanted to join the European Union were then asked to also recognize their own past and their own past misdemeanors, which included also the Holocaust. But there was a certain understanding of what the Holocaust was about and how that genocide happened. And that understanding was that the Holocaust needed two preconditions in order to occur. One was the dehumanization of the victims before they were victimized. That is, thinking of the victims as people who were outside of the circle of human solidarity, who were different. Hope there's no serious clashes happening out there. People who were totally different from us. So as, for instance, during the genocide in Rwanda, the Tutsi were described as cockroaches, and as in Nazi ideology, people spoke about the Jews as Ungeziefer, as vermin, to make that part of humanity or of your own society that you wish to target as completely different from those that you sympathize and empathize with, to bring them out of humanity. So this was considered to be one necessary precondition. There were those who talked about it in terms of anti-Semitism, but that's another topic, not today's topic. The second was to create a mechanism that created the distance between the perpetrators and the victims. Some system in which the killing would be done in a way that would not make individuals directly responsible for it. And indeed, it is true that Nazi Germany eventually perfected the system that we know now as the system of extermination camps, whereby one could take people, say, living in a neighborhood in Berlin, in Grunewald, collect the Jews who lived in that neighborhood, bring them to the train station. Their neighbors would look at them moving to the train station behind their curtains. They would get on the train, and they would be gone. They disappear. So for their neighbors, all they knew was that their Jewish neighbors had taken a train or were put on a train going to the east. They went nach Osten, and we never heard of them again. The people on the train, however, even during the train journey itself, would be dehumanized by the conditions on that train, and by the time they arrived, when the system was perfected, they would very quickly, within a matter of a couple of hours, be taken off the train, be undressed, be shorn of their hair, would be brought into or herded into gas chambers, would be killed there in large numbers within half an hour, and then would be either buried in mass graves or cremated. And so in that system, not one particular individual would be responsible for the entire killing. There is an account by Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of Treblinka and Sobibor, and individually responsible for the killing of about 1.2 million Jews, that he remembered sitting on his white horse on a hill, watching the Jews as they were being herded into the gas chambers, and thinking to himself, as he said later on, that they looked to him like lemmings, like animals who were committing mass suicide. So this was supposed to be the system that perfected this kind of genocide. But I was not satisfied with this explanation, partly because of what I had just seen had happened in Bosnia and Rwanda, and partly because I knew of many other accounts of the Holocaust as well. That is, that in the Holocaust, as in many other genocides, there were moments in which people killed people one-on-one. And I wanted to understand how that actually worked out in the Holocaust itself. We knew even then that about half of the victims of the Holocaust were not killed in extermination camps. And many of them, in fact, the vast majority of them, were killed where they lived. They were killed in their own towns, in their own synagogues, in their own cemeteries, in nearby ravines and forests. They were killed within eyesight of where they had lived. And so I thought that the way to understand how that worked, what was the mechanism, what was the moment of the encounter between the perpetrator and the victim, that in order to understand that, it would be important to focus on one place and to see how things happen in one town. So this was my initial question, if you like, to see what was the nature of the encounter between the perpetrator and the victim, where there was not this convenient distancing mechanism. So I had to choose a town, and it was clear to me that I would choose a town in Eastern Europe, because that was where most of the Jews had lived, and that was where most of the Jews were murdered. Once it came to choosing a town, I chose the town called Buchacz. CZ in Polish is like CH in English or in Spanish. And now it's transliterated from the Ukrainian, so it is written B-U-C-H-A-C-H. So I chose the town of Buchacz. And there were various reasons why I chose that town. There were many other towns that I could have chosen, of course. The first was actually because it was the hometown of a well-known Jewish author that I suspect many of the people in this audience have not heard of, but he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1966. His name is Shmuel Yosef Agnon, or Shai Agnon. His original name was Chachkes, and he was born in Buchacz. Now, he left Buchacz before World War I when he was 21 years old, but much of his writing was about Buchacz, both literally about the town and more symbolically about Buchacz as a microcosm of East European Jewish culture and civilization, particularly small-town culture, which was where large numbers of Jews lived until World War II. And I grew up in Israel, as you heard, and at the time, at least, when I was growing up, in high school, you had to learn Agnon. And I loved reading him, and I thought, well, if I choose a town, why not that town? Once I focused on it, I realized that also many other interesting people came from it. And in fact, now almost every time I give a talk about Buchacz, someone comes up to me and says, I also have a relative from Buchacz, which is curious because it was a town that had less than 10,000 Jews in it. What happened here? They don't like my... Okay. So it was also the hometown of Immanuel Ringenblum. Some of you may have heard of him. He was an historian of Jewish-Polish relations in the interwar period. He went to the gymnasium, to the high school of Buchacz. And in World War II, he established, while he was in the Warsaw Ghetto, he established the so-called Onek Shabbat or Onek Shabbos archive of the ghetto. Now, he and his child and his wife, who were in hiding after the uprising, were denounced and were murdered. But the archive that he established, 2/3 of which were discovered after the war, enabled us to actually write the history of that ghetto. It's also the town of Simon Wiesenthal, the so-called Nazi hunter, who spent the rest of his very long life trying to find Nazi perpetrators and bring them to trial, including many who murdered his own family and my family in Buchacz. But as you heard, it was also my mother's hometown. She actually wasn't born there. She was born in a little village on the banks of the Dniester in a beautiful little place called Koshmiezhin. But she grew up in Buchacz, and she lived there until age 11. When she was 11, in 1935, she and her two brothers and her parents went to Palestine. And in that sense, she was not a Holocaust survivor. She left Buchacz before the war. Had they stayed for another 4 years, as I know now, her chances of survival would have been close to zero. And it so happened that when I was writing this book and using many testimonies, I ran into many testimonies of women survivors who were like her, born in 1924. Now, most were killed, but I read or talked with some who had survived, who were the same age, and I could then envision what she might have gone through had she remained. As you heard, most of my extended family and everyone who came from there or had roots there had extended families. No one else came out, and although I know a great deal about what happened there by now, I don't know what specifically happened to my own family, how members of my family were murdered. Now, when I realized all of this, I decided to interview my mother, which is curious because I was then 41 years old and she was 71, but I'd never actually interviewed her about her childhood. So I turned on a tape recorder and I was there with my 7-year-old son and my 6-month-old daughter, and she was making chicken soup, and I said, in Tel Aviv, and I said, Ima, can you tell me about your childhood? And she spoke for an hour and a half about growing up in Buchach. Now, I won't share the whole story with you here, but what was important for me and for my research, as I gradually understood that, was that she spoke about a very fond childhood. She had good memories of her childhood. She did not speak much about anti-Semitism, about hatred, about fear. She grew up in a Jewish home. They spoke Yiddish at home. Her father sent her to a public school because the Jewish school, the Hebrew school, cost money. The public school was free. So in the public school, she studied in Polish because this was under Poland. Her girlfriends were Ukrainian, so she spoke Ukrainian on the street. She remembered going to the forest, picking mushrooms, picking berries. And as I was listening to this, I understood that my initial question, that question of the encounter between the perpetrator and the victim, was not the full question. It was not, this was the end. In the end, the perpetrators came to this town, chose their victims, and killed them. But in fact, that town was not, as the Jewish imagination has it, a shtetl. It was a Jewish town. It was like all these towns, it was a town of mixed populations. And there were hundreds of them spread throughout the region, from the Baltic to the Balkans, which had mixed population. This town had a population of Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians. And they had lived side by side for a long time. So in many ways, the question that I had changed. It was not only about the encounter between the victims and the perpetrators, it was about the dynamics in a society in which genocide occurs. How do people behave? How do neighbors behave one toward the other in these situations of extremity? And so this took me, this sort of emerging question, if you like, took me on a very long journey. I won't schlep you along the entire journey very long, but I'll just give you some highlights about Buchach. So Buchach, this small town that in 1939 had a population of about 15,000 people, of whom, this is not connected to power, that's why it's, oh. Yeah. Okay. Okay, sorry, this will be even a shorter trip now. So I'll just say Buchach was a small town, one of many that were built during the Middle Ages by this large empire that most people don't remember anymore, called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which straddled much of Eastern Europe, what we know now as Eastern Europe. And these border towns were built to ward off enemies of the empire from the east, the Tatars and the Cossacks, and from the south, the Ottomans, the Turks. So the town exists in documents since 1260. But this empire, this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, disappeared in the late 18th century, and with it, all of Poland, which was partitioned between the larger empires that were now surrounding it. And its southern part was annexed by the Austrian Empire in 1772 and received the name Galicia, or Galicia, or Galician, which was a dynastic trick to excuse the annexation of another country's territory. And that territory of Galicia now became the easternmost and poorest province of the vast Austrian Empire. an empire that had many different ethnic groups, many different nationalities, many different religions, many different languages. The province of Galicia itself was made up primarily of Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews. The largest concentration of Jews in the entire Austrian Empire, later known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was in Galicia. Now, that empire also went the way of all empires in World War I. And after the war, Poland, that had disappeared in the 18th century, was resurrected. And it was resurrected now as a nation state. That is, Poland, the country of the Poles. However, in fact, because of the conquests made by Poland in the aftermath of the war, only 60% of its population were ethnic Poles, which in Poland also meant Roman Catholic. If you were Roman Catholic, you were likely to be Polish and vice versa. The eastern part of Poland, which was Galicia, and some other provinces I won't talk about, had a majority of Ukrainians. And the second largest minority were the Jews. So of the 40% of people in Poland, in interwar Poland, who were not Polish, 20% were Ukrainian and 10% were Jews, and large numbers of them lived in what was Galicia, what you see here in the yellow. Now this means that over a period of hundreds of years, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews in this area that we think of as Galicia, Eastern Poland, now Western Ukraine, had lived side by side. Now, it doesn't mean that this was a pluralistic society in terms that we would think about them now. It doesn't mean that it was a multicultural society as we would like to think about it now. But it also doesn't mean that they were constantly killing each other. In fact, they were living side by side. They had their own religion. They had their own ethnic identity and traditions. They often also had their own socioeconomic niche within society. So different groups did different things. But they interacted with each other all the time. So again, this notion of there being a Jewish shtetl where only Jews lived exists only in the literary imagination, but did not exist historically. People lived side by side on the same streets. When there were tenements, also in the same tenements, one apartment next to another. They knew each other by name. They went to school together. They were on the marketplace together. Now, this existence, and again, I'm saying this is not an existence that we should idealize, but it's also not, as we tend to think of Eastern Europe, as a place where people were constantly at each other's throats. This existence lasted until the latter part of the 19th century. And it is at that point that things start to change. Even before that, each group had a story that it told itself and about others. How it came there, what it was about, who its neighbors were. But these were not necessarily antagonistic stories. They start becoming antagonistic stories with the rise of nationalism in that area. And that's really in the second half of the 19th century. Now, I'll just give you a gist of the different nationalist narratives being told because they explain much of what happens later on. So the Poles spoke about those eastern territories of Poland, about Galicia, about what they call the Kresy, the borderlands, in very, I'd say, well, now they speak about them in nostalgic terms, but they saw themselves as those who came to what they call the wild lands of the East to civilize them. So in many ways, they had a civilizing mission. They came to these wild parts of green Ukraine, as they called it. They built manors, they built towns, they civilized the local population, and by that right of civilizing these areas, they saw them as very much their own. And in many ways, they saw the core of Polish identity as having grown out of these borderland regions that had been taken over by Poland in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. The Ukrainian national narrative was precisely the opposite. So Ukrainians spoke about themselves as the indigenous population that had been colonized by the Poles. They did not speak about Poland as civilizing them, but as colonizing them. They spoke about themselves being enserfed by Polish landlords, as being exploited by them, as being demeaned by them. And when Ukrainians spoke about the Poles as having done that, they usually also added that the Poles did that with the help of their Jewish lackeys. It was the Jews who leased the estates. It was the Jews who often ruled over the peasants. They were doing that for the Polish landlords, who were often absentee, making politics and money in Warsaw or in Western Europe. So there were two competing stories, and at the core of these competing stories was the question of who belongs to this land and to whom does that land belong. And that was the core of the conflict between Poles and Ukrainians from the late 19th century until the aftermath of World War II, and it still has echoes today in debates between Poles and Ukrainians. The Jews living there did not have a story of belonging to this place. And in fact, the one point on which Polish and Ukrainian nationalists agreed was that the Jews did not belong there. So neither did the Jews claim to have ownership on the land, nor did either the Polish or Ukrainian vision of their own future nation states include the Jews in it. Jews spoke about themselves as those who participated in building cities, in creating commerce, and in living a good life in those places. But they did not have until later on a nationalist agenda there. When a nationalist agenda started arising among Jews, and it was very much under the impact of Polish and Ukrainian nationalism, it very quickly transformed, particularly in Galicia, into Zionism. And Zionism, which is nationalism, and which took much of its attributes from territorial nationalism and ethnic nationalism as it was known to Poles and Ukrainians, differed from them in that the land that it spoke about was not the land of Galicia, was not the land of Poland or Ukraine, but was elsewhere, was the Eretz Israel, was the land of Israel. And what that brought about is, again, the topic of another lecture. But I won't talk about that today. Now, until World War I, despite the fact that there are these three different narratives, there is no violence in that area. It's still, the narratives are increasingly antagonistic, but there's no actual violence, in large part because the Austrian Empire, which is anti-nationalist in many ways because it's an empire of many nationalities and many religions and wants them somehow to get along, does not allow it. And as you can see from, this is a very famous photo from Buchach, and Shai Agnon is someplace there on the right-hand corner with the white hat. This is a party rally. It's a political rally in 1907, and the parties at that time were very much organized according to ethnic national criteria. There were Polish parties, Ukrainian parties, and Jewish parties, and they often went in coalition with each other. Often Jews and Ukrainians were in coalition against the Poles because the Poles were the dominant power in that region. Now, all this changes dramatically in World War I. And World War I is a crucial point. If we want to understand the roots of violence in World War II, we have to go back to World War I. World War I in that area is extremely brutal. Many of us don't know much about World War I in Eastern Europe. We may have read the remark on All Quiet on the Western Front. We have some images of that. But in Eastern Europe, the war was extremely destructive. It was destructive of towns. It was destructive, of course, of armies. And there were tens of thousands of soldiers who died in raging battles in the area of this town alone. But it was also destructive of civilian populations. And the Russian army in particular engaged in a great deal of violence, especially against Jewish populations. Again, I can't go into all the details of that, but in Buchach itself, there are records of at least 2 major pogroms there under the first Russian occupation, which was between 1914 and 1915, and in the second Russian occupation in 1916. The population living in these towns is exposed to all this violence, military violence and violence against civilians for a lengthy period of time. Moreover, when the war ends, it does not end in that area. So people in Western Europe remember November 1918 as the end of the war. November 1918 is the beginning of a war between Poles and Ukrainians in eastern Poland or Western Ukraine in Galicia. And that is, as you can see, an extraordinarily brutal war in which large numbers of civilians are killed by Polish and Ukrainian military units who are vying for control of that area of Galicia. Ukrainian nationalists there try to create an independent Western Ukrainian republic, and the Poles want to make that into the Poland that you saw, a Poland that has actually a large Ukrainian minority. By 1921, Poland wins the struggle, creates interwar Poland, and much of the rest of the story of interwar Poland is in its eastern territories is a struggle of Ukrainians to continue expressing their own national aspirations and Polish suppression of that national aspiration. This kind of suppression of nationalism in Poland, not surprisingly, brings about radicalization among the Ukrainian population. And by 1929, Ukrainian nationalists form an organization known as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or by its acronym OUN, and that is a terrorist organization with strong ties to the growing fascist parties and organizations in Eastern Europe, which after 1933 becomes also close to the Nazi regime and is supported and trained by Nazi Germany. The aspiration of the OUN is to create a Pole-free and Jew-free Ukraine. It cannot realize those goals in the 1930s, but it's biding its time and waiting for the opportunity to do that. Jewish populations in that area, especially after 1935, are subjected not only to local anti-Semitism, but also to state anti-Semitism. When the dictator, authoritarian leader of Poland, Pilsudski, dies in 1935, there's a turn to the right in Poland, which means that Jews have fewer and fewer educational and employment possibilities in Poland, and the general tone is that the Jews should go to Palestine. And that's not because Polish nationalists are Zionists, but because they want to get rid of the Jews. So in that sense, actually, my grandfather chose the very last moment to leave. 1935 was really the last moment to leave. After 1935, it becomes increasingly difficult for Jews to leave that area. It's difficult because, as you know, there was a Great Depression in Europe. There is, as we see now too, growing xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments. So for Jews, the gates of immigration to the United States are largely closed. It's much more difficult to go to England. And in Palestine, after 1936, and that's the other place that Jews could go to, in 1936, there's an Arab uprising, and the British mandatory authorities there then imposed growing restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. So Jews living in that area feel increasingly trapped. And those young Zionists that you see here mostly go in small numbers in the 1920s. By the 1930s, it becomes increasingly difficult. Some Jews turn to communism as a result of that. Because communism promises a future that is not based on religion or nationality or ethnicity. All workers of the world unite. The communist cell in Buchach, which is mostly Jewish, is also very small and extremely ineffective. And the one interesting thing about it that I found was that a number of its members who remained still there and alive by the time the Germans came were important in forming Jewish resistance to German rule. And partly because they had a tradition already of being underground even before that. Now, the last part that is important to understand before we reach the events of the Holocaust themselves is that, as you may know, World War II begins in 1939 because there's an agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And that agreement means that Eastern Europe is divided between the Nazis and the Soviets. And that part of Eastern Poland, Galicia, where Buchach is located, now is taken over by the Soviets. And the Soviets are there between 1939 and 1941. In that time, between 39 and 41, the Soviets do what the Soviets always did best. First of all, they take a faltering economy and they ruin it completely. They nationalize the entire economy, and from people being poor, now there's actually severe shortages of food throughout this period. Secondly, they start targeting those they see as their political and social enemies. And they start by deporting large numbers of Poles because they see the Poles as the dominant population there and as anti-Soviet, which they are. They deport large numbers of members of the aristocracy, of the military, and so forth. Secondly, they turn against the Jews, and they deport large numbers of Jews, both as social enemies. If they had a shoe store, if they had a mill, that means that they're rich, and therefore they're deported, or for political reasons if they're Zionists. And at the end, they start turning against Ukrainians. Now, Ukrainians had originally welcomed the Soviet incursion or invasion because they saw that as liberation from the Poles. By about a year later, they realized that the Soviets are not such a great deal after all, and they start organizing against Soviet rule. And as a result of this, large numbers of Ukrainian nationalists are incarcerated in jails toward the end of Soviet rule. Now then, on the 22nd of June, 1941, the Germans invade the former ally, the Soviet Union. And that invasion triggers a wave of violence throughout this region. The first thing that happens is that the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, who has all these political prisoners, most of whom are Ukrainians, in jails in all these small towns, including in the larger town of Lviv or Lviv or Lemberg. It's the capital of this region. They are told either take your political prisoners with you or execute them. And obviously they choose the latter. It's faster and more efficient, and they execute thousands of political prisoners in the jails. And then they leave. And even before the Germans move in this hiatus between the Soviets leaving and the Germans arriving, there is a wave of pogroms against Jews under the argument that it was the Judeo-Bolsheviks, the Jews who were associated with the Soviets, who had killed our own patriots, our own sons. That is, our Ukrainian brothers, our Ukrainian sons, our Ukrainian husbands. And so within a few days, thousands of Ukrainians are killed in the jails, and thousands of Jews living in these towns where these killings occurred are also killed, often while they're being forced to exhume the bodies of the Ukrainians who were just being killed by the Soviets. In the town of Buchach itself, even before the Germans arrive, a Ukrainian militia is organized. It's quite well armed, and it begins, first of all, exercising violence against those it saw as Soviet collaborators, those who worked with the Soviet regime, and against Poles and Jews. The German arrival is celebrated by local Ukrainians who put on their traditional dress and who parade in front of the arriving Germans who are still not fully in control of that area. The Germans have no particular intention of being on the side of the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainian nationalists believe that finally now Germany would allow them to have an independent Ukraine. And while Hitler had no intention of ever creating an independent Ukraine, the local German authorities are very happy to work with the local Ukrainians in order to carry out their own tasks. And their own tasks, as we will see, have to do with killing the Jews. In fact, in 1943, the Germans created an entire SS division of Ukrainian recruits, the Waffen-SS Division Galician, which is a year later destroyed by the Red Army in a battle in Brode. So these are the events that occur immediately as the Germans move in. But the main goal of the Germans in what is now comes to be called District Galician, the district of Galicia, is to murder the Jews there. And after the first wave, when the Germans move further in, the SS establishes outposts, security police outposts in various towns in this region. This is a region that has about 500,000 Jews. The SS is very thin on the ground, or the security police is very thin on the ground. One of the outposts is built in a town called Chortkov, which is right next to Buchach, and it's responsible for Chortkov, Buchach, and a few other towns in that region. There are between 20 and 30 Germans in this outpost, more 20 than 30. It sort of goes up and down. Not all of them are Germans from Germany. Some are ethnic Germans from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Lithuania. These 20 to 30 Germans, mostly between late summer 1942 and early summer 1943, murder approximately 60,000 Jews. When they're not murdering Jews, they're having a mighty good time because they are under no threat. This is a very safe place for them. It's very bucolic there. They have absolute access to food, to alcohol, to tobacco, to sex. They can do whatever they like, and they make much use of that. And they also have absolute power over life and death. And because this is such a comfortable existence, often more comfortable than it was for these men before the war or after the war, they bring their families there. They bring their wives, they bring their children, they at times bring their parents. They also have mistresses and relations there. And there are many accounts from later trials of the kind of social life that was going on there. And as they are conducting this social life, they obviously get to know the people in the area. They get to know the Ukrainians, they get to know the Poles, and they get to know the Jews. Now, clearly, the 20 to 30 Germans could not on their own kill 60,000 Jews spread in towns and villages in a relatively large geographical area. In order to do that, they establish a system. And the system is that they transform that militia, that Ukrainian militia, that was organized initially by Ukrainian nationalists, into an auxiliary police unit that ultimately numbers over 300 men, which assists, of course, these 20 to 30 Germans. They also create police forces, German uniformed police forces or gendarmerie in various towns, including in Buchach, and local Ukrainian police forces, including in the town of Buchach. They also establish or force the Jews to establish Jewish councils, Judenräte, and these Jewish councils also have their own police forces, which are called their Ordnungsdienst. These are Jewish policemen who are not armed with fire weapons, but also participate in this process. And so once all this is put into place, what the Germans have to do is to every once in a while sweep into a town. They surround it with police, with those who were militias before, and then they come in and drag out Jews who are trying to hide, concentrate them, and then either lead them to the train station and take them to an extermination camp, or they kill them on the spot. The killing happens in this way that in the initial phases between late summer 1942 and the end of 1942, Jews are deported to the extermination camp of Berzec, which is the designated extermination camp for Galicia. It's on the Polish-Ukrainian border. And about half of the Jews of Galicia and about half of the Jews of Buchach are transported to Berzec and gassed there. These roundups are not the way I described what happens in a place like Grunewald. They're extremely brutal roundups. Everyone sees what is happening, and hundreds of people are shot on the street even before they're loaded on the trains. So these are very bloody, horrifying events that everyone can see because these are very small towns. By the end of 1942, Berzec is closed. And the rest of the killings, and it's in Buchach, it's more than half of the Jews of Buchach and the surrounding towns, are killed on the spot. They are killed in two sites next to the town, on two hills. One is known as the Federal Hill, and one is the Bashti Hill, where the Jewish cemetery is. So they are killed within walking distance from where they live, and within earshot and eyesight of their own neighbors. Now, as I said, the Germans, because they're there for a lengthy period, and because the mass killing begins only a year after they arrive, they meanwhile get to know the Ukrainian policemen and the Ukrainian population and the Polish population, and they get to know the Jewish population. They use the Jews there as their tailors, as their dentists, as their babysitters, as their maids, as people who come into the home every day and clean for them. They know them by name, and the Jews know the Germans by name. So that by the time the killing begins, people who are doing the killing know the people they're killing, and vice versa. It is a process whereby there is indeed a very intimate relationship within that genocide. Now, just to give you an idea, this is an aerial photograph taken by the Luftwaffe in April 1944, and if you can see the photo, the town is mostly on this bank of the river, of the Strepa, that's the river, and a few houses here. The killing sites are on this hill, that's the Federal Hill, and on this hill, which is the Jewish cemetery. And there are approximately 7,000 people buried there until today in mass graves, unmarked mass graves. Now, once the killing of the Jews, it doesn't end, but the mass killing of the Jews comes to an end in June 1943 when Galicia is declared Judenfrei. It's clean of Jews. There's still a lot of killing of Jews who are hiding or in labor camps, but the vast majority have been murdered. There begins a second wave of a struggle between Poles and Ukrainians. That struggle is not the business of the Germans. They don't care about Ukrainians killing Poles or otherwise, unless it gets in their way. But as German rule in that area starts to disintegrate in 1944, units of Ukrainian nationalists sweep down from Volhynia, which is a province north of Galicia, and start ethnic cleansing of the Polish population in that area, which is extremely brutal. The Poles don't take it lying down. The Polish Home Army is also there. There are armed Polish units there, so there are mutual massacres, although there are far larger numbers of Poles killed because of the disproportionate populations and armed units. So what Ukrainians remember of this entire period is really the end of it. That is that Polish nationalists had been fighting to create a free Ukraine, that then they were reoccupied by the Soviets. As the Soviets come, there is an insurgency, a Ukrainian insurgency against them, and the Soviets respond as they do with vast numbers of NKVD units that destroy entire Ukrainian villages and deport large numbers of people and their families to Central Asia and to gulags. What Ukrainians don't remember so much is members of their own community, such as Volodymyr Kaznovsky, this man, who was a district attorney before the war and became the chief of the police in Buchach, and was the organizer and the facilitator of much of the killing of the Jews of his own community. The Soviets, when they came there, actually tried to understand what had happened and wrote a report and did some sketches and exhumed some bodies in order to understand what happened. But even as they were writing their report, the Soviet narrative of events began changing from that of murdering the Jews by the Germans and their local collaborators to the murder by the fascists of innocent Soviet citizens. And that's the way it remained until the end of the Soviet Union. There was very little mention of the fact that there were members of the community that killed other members of the community, and that the main victims there were Jews. And in fact, when the Jews created this memorial right after the war, and this is all the community that remained, about 60 people out of 8,000, shortly thereafter this memorial disappeared, and it was probably removed by the Soviets, who also planted a forest over the killing sites. And the single small memorial that was put up there and was mostly broken on the forest floor until a few years ago is almost impossible to find now in the forest. You need to have a guide to bring you there. On the other hand, once the Soviet regime was gone, the Ukrainians put up their own memorial there, but this is, of course, a memorial to the martyrs of Ukrainian independence. And there's no mention there that there had ever been Jews in that town. Another memorial was put on another hill more recently of Stepan Bandera, who was the head of the more radical faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And the Cemetery Hill, from which you can see the Fedor Hill, and you can see the town is in the middle, and these are the two main killing sites, until recently was an abandoned cemetery. Every few years, some volunteers come and try to clean it up. There was another memorial put up there a few years ago, but it's already been broken. And the single remaining Jewish site in the town, the main Jewish site was the Great Synagogue, the Goethe Shil. That was destroyed, damaged in the war, and then demolished by the Soviets, who created a cinema out of it. But there was one single edifice that remained, the Bet HaMidrash, the study house that Agnon wrote about in his stories. But in 2001, the mayor sent in some bulldozers to demolish it to build a new shopping center in that area. And what remains of that past is the is the Polish castle, the medieval castle. And last time I was there a couple of years ago, the flag that was flying from the castle was the flag of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which doesn't actually exist anymore, but as a symbol of Ukrainian nationalism and the fight against Russian incursion into Ukraine. Now, I just want to give you a few points, if you bear with me for another 5 minutes, of some concluding comments and what I think I learned from this long journey. The first is, as you will have guessed, is that what I discovered was that the genocidal encounter that I set out to understand between the perpetrators and the victims on the local level was intimate and not detached. In other words, people knew each other. The victims and the perpetrators were known. They were not anonymous. That the killing was public and not private. And there were a lot of debates in the German history about what did the Germans know, and the extermination camps were secret, and there were some rumors, but nobody had seen them. And that may all be true. There's a big literature on that. But in these towns, nothing was secret. Everything was public. Everybody saw everything that was happening all the time. Moreover, the category that we have created for ourselves, we like talking about victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. Because bystanders, well, we also think of ourselves really as, if anything like that happened, we'd probably be the bystanders. That's the best position to be in. But in those cases, in those local cases, there were no bystanders. The category has no meaning because you are always part of the event. There are only degrees of engagement. And I always think about it in terms of people living in say, and there were such then in Buchach, in a tenement, in a four-story house, and you have neighbors on the fourth floor, you know them, your daughters studied together, they sat together in your kitchen, but one day, armed people come into those people's apartment on the fourth floor, which is a nicer apartment than yours, and they take them down to the street and they shoot them. And you feel sorry for them, but now they're dead. And now there is an apartment up there on the fourth floor. It's better than yours. It's got nice pots and pans. It's got good blankets. And if you don't move in, somebody else will move in, maybe the neighbors from the third floor. And so you move in. And once you move in, you become already engaged in this process of genocide, which is for many people, especially in those areas, a profitable undertaking, even if you didn't initiate it. You come away with property. So this category of bystanders has a completely different meaning when you think about it on this level. I also would say that one thing that struck me very powerfully was what I called in the book the ambiguity of goodness. Because evil we can talk about, we can say there were people who were completely evil. They came to kill and they killed and they relentlessly, and they smashed the baby skulls into walls, and the killing was extremely brutal and horrifying. But goodness becomes a much more ambivalent aspect here, because the only way that people could survive, the Jews in these communities could survive, was by their neighbors helping them. There was no other way to survive. You couldn't just go to the forest because you'd die there. You needed to go to a nearby village to knock on a door, and either they gave you some bread or milk, or they denounced you, or they just shut the door in front of you. And that meant that the relationship between people became much more ambiguous. People who took you in might have taken you in because you paid them. Or you might have paid them because they couldn't afford to buy food for you without you giving them money. But then what happened when you ran out of money? What do they do with you? If they tell you, well, we can't support you anymore, just leave, they might be denounced by their neighbors who are already suspicious that they're sheltering Jews and think that they are making money out of sheltering Jews and are a bit envious of them. And they may denounce them, and then the Ukrainian police usually, no, the German police would come and kill both the people they're sheltering and themselves, those who are sheltering them. And some people who shelter Jews became impatient because they couldn't get everything that they wanted, or because those people had some property, a fur coat, good boots that they were not about to give up. And then they killed them. And so this process of a relationship between people, who were the good people? Who could you turn to? Gives us a very different picture than the one we would like to think of those people who were good and altruistic and those who were collaborating. That, by the way, also had to do with a number of Jews in this event, some of whom were in the Jewish police and clearly were engaged in denouncing and helping the Germans in rounding up Jews, and later ended up also in the resistance and fought against the Germans, or rather mostly against denouncers. Another thing that I would point to, and that was hinted at before, is that when you try to understand what happens on the local level, you also understand the huge importance of personal testimony. And that you cannot write a story like this without listening to the people who were part of it. And if you ignore that, if you try to write that story only using official documents, then you're really writing the story of the perpetrators. And the perpetrators often didn't care about what was happening to the victims. And we as historians sometimes feel more comfortable with these documents because they were written at the time, because they have a stamp and a date, and you can trust them, so to speak. Whereas people who talked about the events 10 years later, you say, well, their memory is already not so clear and they've been influenced by what they saw later on. And the result is that you are not telling the story. And if you listen to them and if you combine their own testimonies, you gain a much deeper understanding of the nuances of what happens in a society like this when it is confronted with this kind of genocidal urge, this genocidal encounter. Two last points. One is, I'd say, there is another kind of narrative of these events in Eastern Europe. And I wouldn't say that it's not correct, but I'd say that it's insufficient. That narrative is that Eastern Europe was in the borderland between two vast powers, between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And these two titanic powers clashed with each other over the territory of Eastern Europe. And therefore, the populations there became their victims. And whatever is the number, however we count it, some argue 14 million people, became victims of Stalin and Hitler. Now, in part, it's true. But in part, as you can tell from this kind of story and from hundreds like it, much of the violence, much of the dynamic, and much of the nature of the violence had to do with relations between the people living in these places themselves that preceded the arrival of either the Soviets or the Germans. So while it was necessary to have the Germans there in order to have a particular genocide of the Jews, the nature of the violence, the way it worked out, had a great deal to do with relations between these groups before the war and the different agendas that they had and that they were trying to realize under the rule of those powers. And the last point I make is something that I've been thinking about more really just in the last few years. And that is that when you study an event such as Buchach, and obviously this happened in hundreds of towns along similar lines, you realize how thin the veneer of civilization, the crust of all societies that we live in actually is. You realize how easy it is to disrupt this kind of security that we feel, that this wouldn't happen here. It happened over there, far away, a long time ago, to people who are mostly dead, and it's got nothing to do with us. And you start thinking, and that thought occurred to me, there are communities in this country too that have experienced this, of course, that you hear some noise on the street, and you call the police at 2 a.m. and you say, I think there's a burglary going on, and the police come and they arrest you. And suddenly you realize that everything that you believed in has changed, and it cannot be reversed anymore, because you trust in law, you trust that there is a kind of rule of law, but the law can be turned against you. And you trust in the powers of enforcing it because they're supposed to be on your side. They're supposed to protect you. And how easy it is for them to turn in another direction. And then the next day, your neighbor, whom you always said hello to on the street when you went to work and when you came back, can walk into your house with an axe just because they want your TV. And everything that you believed in has changed and cannot be undone. So thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has any, we have a microphone here. So please raise hands.
And I'm sorry about the interruption here.
We're sorry.
We just lost the power, so perfect timing.
Questions?
Would you say, so you have kind of this Polish-Ukrainian dynamic established during the Commonwealth. Would you say that that changed substantially during the Habsburg Empire? Did the German landowners change this relationship between the two and the Jews in any significant way?
Oh, you mean during the Habsburg period? So what changes under Habsburg, especially after 1848, after the Spring of Nations, and what is crucial, I couldn't go into all of that, but what is crucial is that after 1848, and particularly after the 1860s, there are two major events of emancipation. The serfs are emancipated, and the serfs in that area are mostly Ruthenians, as they were called. They're not Ukrainians. Although their economic state does not greatly improve, because now they have less and less land, they become the backbone of Ukrainian nationalism. They are the group that the nationalizers target to what they call to awaken the masses from their slumber, to tell them that they are a Ukrainian nation. So the emancipation of the serfs is crucial to the process of nationalizing Ukrainians in that area. And the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg or the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that point, does not act against it. It just wants to make sure that there's not too much unrest. The second element there is the emancipation of the Jews, because the Jews too were not emancipated until the 1860s. The emancipation of the Jews means largely that Jews who were not allowed to live and have economic activity in the villages can go to the villages now. They can leave the congested towns and ghettos and go to the villages. Now, when you put the two things together, what happens is that more and more of the Ukrainian national movement becomes anti-Jewish, because they feel that the Jews are now coming and exploiting them in their own villages, that they've come out of the towns, just as the serfs have been liberated. The Jews are coming and taking over their towns, are bringing alcohol brewing, are exploiting the population and preventing the creation of a Ukrainian nation. From the point of view of the Poles, what is interesting is that under Habsburg, the Poles have political autonomy in Galicia, despite the fact that they're a minority, because the Austrian rulers see the Poles, who were the aristocracy, the ruling aristocracy before they came, as those who will naturally rule over that place. And so much of the political power and a fair amount of the economic power remains in the hands of the Poles under Austrian rule. And so the main changes, I would say, are those of emancipation on the one hand, and of the fact that the Austrian regime, unlike the Russian regime, allows the creation of nationalism. And Galicia is spoken about as the birthplace of Ukrainian nationalism. This was not the case in Congress Poland, in areas that the Russians were ruling. Does that help?
My question concerns the role of ideology. I mean, your earlier work emphasized, I believe, the role of ideology in the Holocaust, and now this account really de-emphasizes the role of ideology, whether it be Nazism or kind of genocide or anti-Semitism. I'm wondering the extent to which the focus on the Holocaust as a product of a particular ideology or a particular variety of anti-Semitism, genocidal anti-Semitism, has in a way detracted from our ability to understand what really happened, and also to situate, as you've done in this book and in your lecture, the Holocaust in the context of genocide. So in other words, it's not just a product of a particular evil ideology, Nazism, and a particular kind of anti-Semitism. Is that?
Yeah, but, so, I mean, you're right. There are two, to me at least, there were two interesting aspects to this. You know, I also wrote about the barbarization of warfare, about the ideological motivation of soldiers, of Wehrmacht soldiers, and it was interesting to me. I couldn't get into all of that here, but Toward the end of German rule in that area, as it's disintegrating, and the SS, the Gestapo are leaving, they're not staying for the actual fighting, German army units, which are retreating from Ukraine into these areas, come into this area, and some of them see massacres of Jews. These are not Jews being killed by the Gestapo, by the security police. They're killed by local bandits, by peasants, by disbanded nationalist units, by all kinds of elements, but it's not Germans. And some of these, there are a few examples that I know from Jewish testimonies. Some of these Germans, including at least a couple of German officers, are appalled by what they see. And they announce to the Jews that they're going to protect them. And there's one town called Tłuste, which is near Buchach, in which a German army officer says that he's going to protect the Jews from the Ukrainian hooligans, right, until the Red Army comes. And this rumor flies around in the forest where people are still hiding, and surviving Jews start converging on that town. And about 600 Jews end up there. And he stays about like a couple of hours before the Red Army comes in. Tragically, once the Red Army comes in, the Luftwaffe bombs the town, and there are many sick people who had been surviving in the forest and had obviously undernourished and so forth. And so between 100 and 200 of them are killed in that bombing. So they survive until the liberation, then they're still killed. But we know about all of this because of the Jewish testimonies. I don't know the name of this man because the Jews didn't know his name. And he may have had a lot of blood on his hands, for all I know. But so for me, this was important because it does not take the German perpetrators off the hook. The genocide there would not have happened this way had Germany not had an ideology and a politics which was about merging all the Jews. There would have been violence against Jews, there was before and there was after, but it would not have been this kind of genocide or violence. This was a German undertaking. To me, that's obvious. But that's not what this study was about. This study was about what happens when people with such an ideological drive come into a town in very small numbers. How do they organize that, and what does it look like? And there you see a lot of other things happening. And there what would happen in many other places. There what happened in many other genocides. Ideology is there. Anti-Semitism was there. There was anti-Semitism among peasants that goes back before the term was invented. There was anti-Semitism, a Polish state anti-Semitism, obviously. And then there was the German genocidal drive. But there is also a community in which people have lived side by side for a very long time, and they know each other. And so how does that work out? And for me, this was a question that was relevant both to understanding the Holocaust, because so much of the Holocaust actually happened there and didn't happen in Auschwitz or in Treblinka. And even, as I said, even Jews who end up in Bezetz, there are about 250,000 Galician Jews who end up in Bezetz, before they end up there, undergo all of that, everything that I was describing here. So it tells you something about the Holocaust that we haven't actually talked about and understood, and it means that so much of the Holocaust is similar to other genocides. There are differences, and the differences are with the extermination camps, with the system of transporting people across a continent. Yes, that is unique because we haven't had extermination camps before or after, but so much of the Holocaust unfortunately looks like so many other genocides, and it's so intimate and so, in some ways, horrifyingly understandable, because if you look at it from the point of view of the people there, there is ideology, there are prejudices more than ideology. There's resentment, which is maybe the most powerful motivator. But it's something that you can recognize in any society. It's actually quite normal. That's why I called this chapter The Daily Life of Genocide, which describes this, because in some ways it becomes a normal thing. Everybody understands it. And the curious thing is that people talking about this period often said two things that appear totally contradictory. One was, they said, we always knew it would happen. We knew that it was leading to that. And the other was, we couldn't imagine that this would happen. And it's these two sentiments that I think reflect the nature of a society, of any society really, and how easy, if you like, it is to transition from security to insecurity, from living together to exerting violence.
Thank you. I'm wondering if this has changed your perspective on prevention strategies since this study. I'm particularly interested in, early stage prevention strategies is a big conversation these days. And what have you learned in those early stages that in your study that would maybe be actual policies that could be implemented and strategies that people could use?
So, I started studying genocide before I did this book, but it was sort of from above and from aside. And this book did, I think, clarify to me certain things. I'd say that the most obvious is something that probably most of you have thought about, but that we see nowadays increasingly in countries and societies where we thought it was over, and that is identifying groups as outsiders, whether they are within our society or on our borders, and saying these groups, these people, they have characteristics that are different from us, they are either inferior to us, or they are dangerous to us, or they have certain predilections that are criminal, or that are immoral, or whatever it is, that they're outside of what I called earlier our sort of universe of solidarity. They don't belong. Now that we know that this is a sort of sign. It doesn't mean that genocide is going to happen, but it does mean that a certain group is made increasingly vulnerable and increasingly seen as one to which our own laws, our own morality, our own ethics don't apply. But there is another thing, and I think that's, to me, that's how should I put it? It's more disturbing because it's more ambivalent. And that is that what we, as I was trying to say earlier, what we perceive as our defenses against violence, either state violence or chaotic violence, those are exactly the same forms, the same institutions, the same agencies that can be used against us. That is, that when we say what is being done now is legal, and the law is not a test of morality, the law is law, and you have to obey the law. When you see that the law is used to not simply exert violence, but to do what you find to be criminal, what you find to be abhorrent, and you accept that because it's the law, then it has to be obeyed, then you are already in the process of legitimizing state violence, often in the name of preventing chaos, of preventing the collapse of what you feel protects you. And as long as you are not a member of that group that was outed, a member of that group that was seen as outside this moral universe, you're fine. But once that happens, there is no telling when you would become part of the other group. Anything that you might do or say would make you part of that group. And so the longer you wait, the more likely it is that either you become complicit or you become targeted. And that's a very difficult issue to deal with. We know that the people who were doing the killing in a town like Buchach were not acting against their own laws. They were following orders, so to speak. Although much of what they did, they just did because they felt like it. So this is the conundrum. When do you step in? And when do you say, not only about others who are across the border, but when you see that what is the universe that protects you turning against others, how do you respond? And to me, we don't talk enough about that, not in our own societies. We believe that we learn the lessons of history, and the less we teach history, the more we rely on those lessons that nobody is learning anymore.
That was just stunning, talk with stunning explanatory power and a really different characterization of these events than I've heard before, and I've been studying this for decades. But what you've been talking about now in the question and answer and your last comment about the thinness of the veneer of civilization, which is really speaking to us in our own moment, and where some of your explanations are not historical or ideological, but psychological, like the power of resentment, underscores for me that there is a piece of this, a leap that I can't make, and that is from resentment, complicity, worrying about becoming a victim, all of these things that erode civilization, the erosion of the rule of law or the reversal of law, how to get from there toward the place where regular people can murder their neighbors. That is, none of us in this room imagines that there is any circumstance under which we are capable of taking a baby and killing it. So that last leap from, nothing makes sense anymore, and I'm vulnerable, and I wish I had a warmer blanket, to killing somebody, that's what I'm missing.
Look, I mean, I don't think there's a single or a satisfactory explanation. A student of mine just finished a dissertation on events in Bukovina in Bessarabia, so just south of this region. And he, among other things, asked this question. And there is he cites a psychological study, actually, that talks about this, not in terms of genocide, but talks about this dynamic of massacre. And I think that Christopher Browning talks about this in another context in his book on Ordinary Men. In any group, and this is certainly true for these 20 to 30 Germans that I talked about here, in any group, there would be 1, 2, 3, 4, in this case it's almost always men, who are more willing, more capable of to commit murder, to kill. When people were interrogated by the West German police 2 decades later about this, they were asked, "Did you have an Exekutionskommando?" or Schießkommando, or whatever they called it, and an execution squad. And they said, "No, we didn't need one." for two reasons. First, there were always people who were willing to do it. It was no problem. There were some guys who always, and they named them, you know. There were this guy and that guy. They always, so they just did it. But they say, but the thing is, there were others who wanted to participate, but they were not called upon. And so they would wait, they would lurk behind them in killing, in execution actions. You know, once everybody was rounded up and all that, then you take them to the pits and you shoot them next to the pits. And if one of the shooters ran out of ammunition, had to change his magazine, one of the others would leap in and say, no, it's fine, I can do it. Let me do it. Now, what is the dynamic here? I mean, these are not, some of them probably had sadistic tendencies, some of them had homicidal tendencies. Many of them were policemen before the war and after the war. They helped old lady cross streets. They were good citizens. They were good fathers, and quite a number of them had daughters and sons at home. So some were more likely to kill than others, and others were infected by that, or found that it could be enjoyable, or found that it gave them a sense of power. There were people there, civilians, engineers, who came to rebuild the railroad tunnel and bridge that the Soviets had blown up. It was the marvel of Galicia. There was a tunnel. And so the workers, of course, were Jews, but there were foremen who came there, German, Italian, Yugoslav. And in interrogating them, it turned out that they came to watch the killings. They were curious. What does it look like? And some of them described them. And they have to describe how women carrying children walk into the pits to be shot, and how they have to wait their turn so they see others being shot before they... So what does that tell us about... And some of them had arms, and it turns out they occasionally also participated. They didn't have to. No one asked them to. So that is happening within a context in which there is a power that comes in that declares a certain group that it has to be killed. It shows right away that these people can be killed. However, doesn't matter. You can smash them against walls. You can do whatever you like. That triggers all kinds of urges in people that they may never discover if they are not in that situation. There were some who were different, I'm sure. There were some neighbors who were totally altruistic, but they were extremely rare. And it was much more common for people to accept the situation. Mothers, housewives, who stood on the third floor window with a son or daughter who were running a very gemütliches house, and seeing from the window how young women were running, being pursued often by Ukrainian policemen and shooting them, and talking, how do we protect our children from that, from seeing that? They're living right there. They have a perfect view of everything. So I think that we need to rethink our expectations, because much of what we do and believe we would do depends on the circumstances in which we live and expect to live. And when those circumstances change, and they change partly because we change them, we are part of the circumstances, then something else happens. That's the best that I can offer now.
On that very sobering note, I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody. I know I can listen completely engrossed. This was deeply moving, informative, very rich, and thought-provoking. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.